The world is trying to reach net zero emissions to stave off the effects of increased global temperatures, but it's not even meeting its own targets. The United Nations Weather Agency said on Tuesday that the year between March 2023 and February 24 is almost certain to have broken the 1.5 degrees Celsius target set at the Paris Accords. Scientists agree the switch to green energy is going too slowly, but that it will eventually happen. The question then is, at that point, what state will the world be in? I'm Neil Harvey, and today's Newsmaker is life after net zero. China has pledged to reach net zero emissions by the year 2060, the United States by 2050 and India by 2070. But even if those ambitious goals are met, the problems won't simply end there.
It's the year 2100. Children born in 2024 will be 76 years old and experiencing a vastly different world from what we know today. Temperatures are at least 2 degrees C hotter than pre-industrial times. People are facing unprecedented challenges to adapt. The world has reached net zero emissions, but the planet is grappling with the consequences of 2 centuries of burning fossil fuels. Warnings weren't ignored, but action came too slowly.
Earth is issuing a distress call. The latest State of the Global Climate Report shows a planet on the brink. Fossil fuel pollution is sending climate chaos off the charts. Sirens are blaring across all major indicators. Last year saw record heat, record sea levels, and record ocean surface temperatures.
In 2100, sea levels have risen by up to 1 meter, leading to coastal inundation. The Arctic is likely to be ice-free in summer, while the Mediterranean coastline in Europe is slowly transforming into desert. Some parts of the world may be too hot for humans to live, while others are facing more wildfires, drought, or extreme rainfall. The increasingly extreme variation in the climate also threatens food security.
The cost of climate action may seem high, but the cost of climate inaction is much higher.
World leaders in 2015, 85 years before the year 2100, pledged in Paris to keep the world's temperatures at no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But that target was all but breached just 8 years later in 2023.
The year 2023 set new records for every single climate indicator. This annual report shows that the climate crisis is the defining challenge that humanity faces. It is an existential threat to vulnerable populations everywhere, and particularly in the island states.
So in 2100, while average temperatures might have stabilized, they won't fall for centuries without intervention. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere don't just disappear. The slowly looming threat at that point is that the vast deposits of ice on Greenland and Antarctica will continue dumping trillions of litres of water into the oceans. Sea levels will continue to rise. If the Greenland ice sheets disappear, the world's oceans will rise by 7 meters. If Antarctica loses its ice, the figure is around 65 meters. It's a problem scientists, climate activists, and humanity will be dealing with for a long time beyond 2100.
To discuss this in more depth, let's go to our panel of guests. Joining me now from Ankara is Reem Al Saffar. She is a climate justice activist and the co-founder and executive director of the Middle East and North Africa Youth Network. Robert Bellamy joins us from Manchester. He's a lecturer and climate change programme director at the University of Manchester. And in Penang, Malaysia, is the global engagement director for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. That's Harjeet Singh. Welcome to you all. I'd like to begin by just reminding everybody, of course, the discussion of how to get to net zero emissions has been had many, many times, and it is a very long conversation. So I would like us to skip forward in time. Let's imagine that net zero has been achieved. Let's say, hopefully, it's been achieved by the year 2100. And let's talk about the problems that would still exist and would need to be tackled. So coming to you first, Harjeet. The planet's net zero, fantastic. There are still going to be an increasing number of floods, droughts, wildfires. Food production is going to be a major challenge in those circumstances. If we understand that there is going to be a greater risk of, for example, a failed wheat or rice harvest in the likes of the major producers, China or India, if we know that that is going to be more likely in the future, what can be done to counter that risk? What can be done to avoid widespread famine?
Neil, thank you very much for having me. And this is such an important conversation because the whole world prioritizes reducing emissions, which is absolutely needed. But the reality is that we are already facing climate impact in 2024. And this has been going on for several years. And few decades down the line, the impacts are going to be much greater because of the past emission impacts are already locked in. And what we are going to see is only impacts multiplying where we are at this moment. So if we see our crops failing, which is happening even now, then the whole food security of populations around the world is going to be affected because we are living in an interconnected world where impact at one place affect people throughout the world because we have now supply chains which are so intertwined. And if this is the reality, then the whole world is going to face the consequences. And a lot can be done beforehand in terms of understanding the scale of impact. This is where we talk about putting early warning systems in place and adopting measures to adapt to climate change, looking at various temperature rise scenarios, strengthening community systems, protecting water, doing soil conservation, and coming up with those techniques that are going to use less water and will be able to adapt to erratic weather patterns. So a lot can be done. We already have science telling us what is required, but where we are lacking is putting those measures in place, particularly because of lack of finance, technology, and capacity.
Just very quickly, if I may, Harjeet, before I go to our other guest, I just want to ask you, because now the countries that control fossil fuels wield a lot of power because of that. In the future, is it possible we'll see the countries who are the major food producers and who control the drinking water, will they wield power because of that?
Well, any resource that is scarce and whoever controls it gets power. So you are absolutely right. Countries who are going to have access to food, water, and even those technologies that are going to be important to adapt to climate change are going to be far more powerful. And that's why when we talk about solutions, we need to talk about building capacity of people and looking at more decentralized and community-owned adaptation and not which are dictated by corporate power.
Coming across to you now, Reem, if we look to a future where the world has heated up even further, sea levels will be continuing to rise even at net zero, is the way that we grow food or even the types of food that we grow likely to change?
Well, of course. First of all, going back to the question, how achieving net zero by 2100 is a little hard for me to think about because, imagine we're already seeing a demo play of the disaster scenarios today that we will see more and more of in the future and more extreme natural events happening in the future because of climate change. And so to think that we will take that long, that we will take until 2100 to achieve net zero, I can't imagine how we will be able to even survive as a civilization, to even have systems that work for us at that time, in that year, that haven't yet affected humanity. So at this point, we already have growing food security issues, exacerbated by droughts, exacerbated by rising temperatures, and our crops currently are not well fit to handle the the future temperatures, and we need to adapt our crops and our food systems as well. So when we're talking about food security, when we're talking about adapting our agri-food systems to a climate with rising temperatures to the future, we really need to make sure that we invest in the technologies that will allow us to do that through science, through funding, technologies, and also non-state actors. One of the biggest issues we have right now is that we have the technologies, we have the solutions present, but these solutions cannot be deployed often because there often isn't an enabling environment for non-state actors, for innovators, for people with the solutions to put these solutions forward and deploy them in real life and on the ground. So one thing we need to do is not just find the solution, but also really urge our leaders and our governments to work both with the public and the private sector to work together in order to have policies that enable these changes to happen on the ground, because often it's the people who aren't doing the changes, it's the people on the ground, it's the farmers themselves who are often really finding solutions, and the scientists working with them to adapt crops that are more resilient to our temperatures and to a changing climate.
Robert, let's bring you in here. As I mentioned earlier, even when the planet does become net zero, the effects of that aren't going to be instant. For example, sea levels will continue to rise. Now, one of the big challenges is going to be for coastal cities. I mean, even now, we see the Indonesian capital, Jakarta, it's predicted by experts, it's going to be underwater perhaps as soon as by the year 2030. It might not be around by 2100. In that situation, if you look at some major coastal cities with huge populations, the likes of Shanghai, Miami, New York, is coastal defences going to be enough to keep them in existence? Will we need to find alternative ways, or will actually some parts of the world just have to be abandoned?
Yeah, that's a really tough question to answer, I suppose, because it depends a lot on the scientific projections that you're talking about. On the one hand, and then in terms of how you would respond to those, depending on what materializes. So, yeah, I mean, there are some areas around the world that are already kind of, going underwater. Tuvalu, for example, low-lying island states are already, facing very severe impacts of sea level rise. And for those countries, I mean, they're the ones who pushed for 1.5 degrees to be adopted as the kind of aspirational target, at least in terms of addressing the Paris Agreement. But for them, the reality now is that it's probably very likely that they're going to have to relocate. And I think for other places as well, that may well become a possibility. Other than that, it depends very much on the climate scenarios that you're looking at. So, for example, in your report, you mentioned a few large-scale tipping elements in the Earth's climate system, like a collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet or Greenland, which can lead to several meters of sea level rise, which is obviously very catastrophic. But the kind of timescales over which those will unfold is kind of hundreds of thousands of years. So in those cases, you'd have much longer to adapt. But again, that does pose quite significant challenges for like how you're going to move cities with, millions and millions of people potentially. But depending on the amount of sea level rise that you've got, there are various options available beyond, facing inundation. These include, hard infrastructural installations like seawalls. There are more ecosystem-based approaches, such as using mangrove swamps. Or, there are flexible flood defenses as well. Individual households and companies can deploy flood barriers that can be deployed at quite short notice. So, just to echo what the other panelists were saying, there are, we already have many of the options available for addressing these things. It's just a case of really implementing them and trying to understand the technical and social challenges in terms of implementation.
Harjeet, when we're talking about some places becoming so hot people can't live there, perhaps they will be underwater, or maybe there's just no food available. People are going to move and they're going to seek sanctuary somewhere else, which will create a whole host of problems for the country that receives those immigrants, just in terms of being able to provide them with food, being able to provide them with a place to live, also just how do they integrate into society and the financial aspect of that. I mean, is there a solution that people have come up with to deal with mass migration?
Neil, that's a fundamental question, and this is a reality that we are facing already in many parts of the world. Just to quote a number, in 2022, there were 32.6 million people who were displaced internally. This is internal displacement number, which means people who were moved within their own country. And the reality also is that only a fraction of such people who are displaced cross their national borders. So I think the biggest issue is the host country itself. The domestic situation is going to be such that even in those areas, providing support to people who are being displaced by increasing number of disasters or places becoming uninhabitable is going to be extremely complex. And then, of course, when they cross borders, things are going to be far more complex, especially in the absence of any such legal framework available to provide them assistance, which we still have, in other cases such as war, the Refugee Convention, but nothing to deal with situations where people are forced to cross borders because of climate change impacts. So one, we are missing that global framework, which is going to make them far more vulnerable. And second, we also need to provide support to countries where these where people are living and they are forced to migrate. And I think the important aspect is to recognize their right to live and also right to move, which brings us back to the point that we have to scale up adaptation so that they have a right to live in a safe and dignified manner. And when situations are beyond our control and migration and displacement are inevitable, then they should be their rights should be respected at various levels, at local, national, and even at international level.
Robert, just listening to the conditions, that we're talking about, they're hypothetical, but they're also quite likely, according to a lot of experts, where, the world has heated up, mass migration is a possibility, and food availability could be another challenging issue. I mean, there is, as I understand, the potential solution to try and unwind some of the damage that mankind has done to the planet. It's kind of colloquially called geoengineering. First of all, just explain to us what that means and how realistic would you say it is?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so geoengineering is a very eclectic category of novel technologies and approaches, and some not so novel actually, for trying to reverse the effects of climate change in different ways. Most of the time today, people mean by geoengineering, they mean solar radiation modification, which involves reflecting a portion of sunlight back into space in order to cool the Earth. There's a whole range of different ways in which you could do this. The best known is one called stratospheric aerosol injection, which involves spraying sulfur particles into the stratosphere, which are reflective and would cool the Earth that way. It's a bit like a volcanic eruption. That's the kind of natural analogy. So when we look back through the climatic record, you can see that every time there's a big volcanic eruption around the world, there's quite a big dip in global temperature for a couple of years, whilst the reflective particles are up there, and then they fall out the atmosphere again, and the temperature goes back to where it would have been anyway. So the question is then that people are asking, well, why don't we do that ourselves if volcanoes can do it? There's other techniques as well, like placing mirrors in space. I saw you've got a picture of those on your panel at the back there. There's some more mundane ideas as well, like just painting urban areas white or engineering crops so that they have a whiter appearance and are more reflective in that way.
Robert, some of the more scientific methods that you mentioned there, are they science fiction or are they actually practical? Could these work?
Technically speaking, in terms of deploying stratospheric aerosol injection, it should be fairly straightforward. We're talking about maybe kind of flying some planes up there and dispersing the material that way. Other people have proposed missiles or kind of balloons with a hose pipe attached to it.
Are we
so
talking
the way
proposals at this point? Have there been any practical experiments done to see if these are viable?
Well, there's been a few experiments proposed in the research community that haven't quite got off the ground because they've been encountering problems around conflicts of interest on patenting or opposition from local community groups. But interestingly, there have been at least one or a few ongoing attempts, I think, from at least one or two companies that are starting to look into this. Yeah, but I mean, they're not kind of doing anything on a scale that would have, worldwide climatic impacts at the moment. But this really highlights the importance for kind of getting some governance in place at this point, so it doesn't kind of remain like a Wild West.
Reem, let's bring you back in. As the founder of a youth network yourself, how do you feel about this situation? So you're looking at the prospect, perhaps, of a world that's become superheated. The future generations will have to deal with the repercussions of the world that we've created now. How do you feel about the prospect of trying out something like geoengineering to try and make their world better?
Well, one thing I really would like to highlight when it comes to many different regions of the world, and when it comes to finding solutions that would work for these regions in the context of these areas, is that we don't always need the most cutting-edge technology. As you mentioned, it doesn't have to be something out of a science fiction movie. Sometimes we need just solutions that work within the contexts that they are needed. And sometimes these solutions might not look like the most technologically advanced technology that you would see in a European country. Sometimes in the global south, we might just need technologies or solutions that work within the context of that area, of that country, to start with a positive impact, to start with, because the issues we have there, and also the people you're dealing with, the mindset of the farmers, for example, and the people who are producing our foods, they have a lot of knowledge that they've gained over a few years, over their lives and their works, but at the end of the day, trying to get them, they will have to be the people who use these technologies. And sometimes aiming only for the highest and the most advanced might not be the solution. And we have to find compromises for these things to work. So I do think that certain technologies can, and I do think that funding research and innovations in these areas is very important, but we also have to think about where are these technologies going to be deployed, where are they going to work best, and we really want to look at efficiency and cost. Are they cost effective, and are they efficient in both how long does it take to have them work on the ground, and also is that efficient, is that viable to us as a society and in the very short time that we have.
Okay, let's go back to Harjeet. Harjeet, painting roofs white, for example, it's a practical thing that's done now. It's not going to help people in the future, I suspect. How do you feel about the risk-reward element of, drastic situations might call for drastic action? Would you take the risk on using science to try and extract CO2 from the atmosphere as a way of unwinding that damage, rather than, because some of the scientific estimates about how long CO2 remains in the atmosphere, they're pretty scary, ranges from hundreds of years to thousands of years. Do you think mankind can wait that long?
Well, we need to first understand who is promoting that narrative and who's going to be benefiting from it. Any solution that we talk about, there are going to be winners and losers. And we cannot afford a situation where communities and countries who are least responsible for the crisis face unintended consequences. When we talk about applying geoengineering at a planetary scale, we know that it cannot be fairly or effectively governed, as Rob was mentioning about governance. And we also know that there are going to be unacceptable risks if it is implemented at that scale. And there are many more challenges. There is whole issue of moral hazard. So countries and companies who are responsible for the crisis are the ones who are promoting these technologies instead of moving away from fossil fuel-based development. The reality is that we just cannot afford to burn fossil fuels anymore. We cannot go for exploration and expansion. We need to stop that fossil fuel-based development and move away from these oil, gas, and coal in a just and equitable manner. So we cannot rely on these technologies. If we start doing that, it's also going to delay climate action. So we, as civil society, in fact, are behind this call for an international non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. That's what we are demanding. What we need is a rapid, just, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. So we need to look at the whole issue also from a moral perspective, and who needs to act much more, and who are going to be affected if we apply these unproven technologies.
Okay, we will wrap it up there. I would just like to thank you all for participating in this discussion, to Reem and to Robert and to Harjeet. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And thank you to you guys at home for watching. It's always a pleasure. Remember, you can follow us on X and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You've been watching the Newsmakers. I'm Neil Harvey. See you next time.